barriers to agriculture development. Last time, we talked about the importance of agriculture for economic development and what role or what contributions agriculture make toward development. I usually start the lecture by giving you, responding to your feedback, which I do appreciate. So before we start talking about the barriers, different barriers to agriculture development, I'll quickly show you what, how I'm going to address your comments from the previous lecture. And also, I'm going to do a very quick recap to what we have done last week, and then we'll start the new lecture. You rated the lecture 4.2 out of 5. That's an average. I put everything you, most of the points that you liked in the lecture, but also I wanted to comment on what you wish to see in the next lectures. So the first point, which is, so I'm not going to comment about the what you liked. So hopefully you're gonna have the same in this lecture and the next lecture. So you're gonna continue to like these points, but I think more importantly is the what you expect to see in this lecture and the next lecture. So the first point, PowerPoint with PDF. Unfortunately, I don't use PowerPoint, so that's why I use LaTeX, which produce PDF only. Exam questions. People asked the topics to the exam questions, so I promise I will do this from next time. It was very interesting. People asked to put questions about what we're going to teach. So to see your knowledge about the topic we're going to teach, which I did today. So the slides, my slides will have a few questions about what we're going to talk about. So last time I asked about what you have done before, but people suggested to have some question about what we're going to do. Less additional readings, I can't promise, because additional readings, it's for you. So you want to read it, it's up to you. You don't want to read it, it's up to you. So it's just keep in mind that other people might want to have extra additional resources to look at and to read. So less additional readings, or people think like everything has to be in the slides. This is not the best way to learn about any topic. It's just to confine yourself to a few slides. This is not the best way to learn. Okay, so as I said from last lecture, you enjoy this lecture, find your own resources. If you don't like my suggestions, if you want to find other resources, the world is open for you, so you just go and find your own resources. So it's not fine. So if you don't like what I suggest to read, that's fine. You don't have to read it, but you have to find your own resources then. Okay. We'll come back to this point when we talk about the exam and what is expected from you when you answer the question in the exam. Okay. So we'll come back to this point. Backward and flipping through the slides, sometimes I go back and forward. So I'll try to slow down when I do that, and I'll try to explain why I need to go back. No bad jokes. I'll try to make better jokes, so hopefully. Add videos. I added videos today. So there's one or two videos today. And I'll give you more time to answer the question. So these mainly the comments from last time. As you know, we still, this is the second lecture in block D, where we talk about factors of production and their role in development. We're still talking about agriculture. Last time we talked about the contribution of agriculture. And today we'll talk about the barriers of agriculture development. So as a quick recap or a quick summary, so if you haven't attended last lecture, so the next few minutes, this is exactly the takeaway message. So that's what you should have learned, or that's what you should have known by attending last lecture. So we started with some motivation. I tried to explain why agriculture is important. So I tried to explain to you the context. So the context we have here is that we have global poverty. There are some efforts to combat or fight global poverty, but this and poverty is already declining. And I show you one of the graphs that show you the how poverty is declining from since 1980s till today, but still not fast enough, because we still have 10% of the world population live in extreme poverty. So they live on less than $2 per day. Okay. And 80% of those who live in extreme poverty, they live in rural areas. And this is where I was coming from. This is my motivation. This is how I try to explain why agriculture is important, why we need to understand the role of agriculture in development. Because 80% of extremely poor people live in rural areas. And 65% of those work in agriculture, not just living, they work also in agriculture. So we need a healthy agriculture sector for any rapid economic development program. So you need a healthy and good agriculture sector. And we show that this is something important for Rosto's growth model. So we have 5 stages to reach the takeoff stage. You have to have this sort of healthy agriculture sector. So the contribution, what contributions agriculture makes to development? So we identified 4 types of contributions. We talked about first as a product. So agriculture, the most obvious reason why agriculture is important, because it provides us with food. Yeah, everyone needs food. I didn't say wants, everyone needs food. So you can't live without food, so we need food. So agriculture, so we need to increase the marketable surplus, which is the difference between total output and the subsistence needs. So this is something that comes from agriculture, and this is the contribution from agriculture as a product. Also, agriculture sector contribute toward as a factor of production, so it provide labor, and we explain Arthur Lewis dual sector model, and we explain how unlimited supply of labor in the subsistence sector and how they transferring this sort of extra supply or surplus from the subsistence sector to the industrial sector will help, will push development forward. We explain different, and when the turning point will happen, then when the surplus, when we take all this surplus out of agriculture, then productivity will rise in agriculture sector, then wages will rise, and we will reach some sort of a turning point. Also, it provides capital, so it's a source of savings as well. It's not just labor. So labor and capital both as factors of production. In addition to this, it provides markets. So there are 2 sides here, demand side, so it's market for industrial goods, and also supply side, where it provides cheap food and inputs. Cheap food and inputs, the idea of the pricing, we'll come back to this in a second. The 4th contribution is foreign exchange, where at early stage of development, agriculture sector could be the primary, could be one important source of foreign exchange through primary commodity exports. The last point I want to refer to, which we covered last lecture, is the pricing agricultural products. We explained that low agricultural prices may benefit industry, and there are some sort of argument that peasant farmers, they looking for fixed income, and if you increase the prices, then they will drop the number of hours they work, because they have some sort of backward bending supply curve of effort. We show that this is not right, because farmers do respond to incentives, price incentives. We explain also that, yes, low farm prices could be good for industry from the supply side, because the industrial sector will have cheaper raw material, and that will increase profitability. That means more investment in the industrial sector. But on the other hand, low farming prices might not be good for industry from the demand side, because that means low purchasing power. Okay, and remember the agriculture sector provide also demand for industrial goods. So if there's low purchasing power in the agriculture sector, that means that this demand might not be high as it should be. So we said that, well, there must be some sort of equilibrium in terms of trade between the 2 sectors in order to have balanced growth between both sectors. So if you haven't attended the lecture last time, so this is pretty much everything we discussed. Maybe we talked about this in more detail, but this is mainly the main message or the takeaway message from last lecture. Okay, so yes, do you have any question about last lecture? On Hanomics now, there's a page, a web page for the for this module, so where I'm gonna post some material. Also, the lecture recording now, it is I just uploaded today in the morning. It is now there, so it is on Hanomics YouTube channel. Now it's time to go on Socrative, whether China today has reached a turning point according to the dual sector model, which a debate we briefly highlighted last time in the lecture. So just see if you remember this sort of debate. We briefly talked about that. And also the second question number 3 here is, in what ways do agriculture and industrial sectors of an economy complement one another? As I said, today we'll talk about the barriers to agricultural development. And if you remember, I said this is something I witnessed myself because I was born in a small village in Egypt. So if you have questions that you think are important to understand the context, please feel free to ask those questions, and I hopefully will be able to answer your question based on my own experience, not just not based on the textbook or some research that I read in the past, but also based on my own experience as someone who lived most of his childhood maybe in a very small village. So, but before I do that, this is something I will discuss today, and again, this is a response to your suggestion. People ask me to put questions about what we're going to discuss, so we test their previous knowledge before we start talking about the topic. So I'm going to talk now about is agriculture productivity, because one of the things that we said last time is that to increase marketable surplus, you need to increase productivity in agriculture sector. So what do you mean by agricultural productivity? And how can we measure it? This is what we're going to talk about. So we didn't talk about this last time, but we're going to talk about it today. Okay? But briefly mentioned that it is important to increase productivity, and for a good reason, because we say we have a fixed supply of land and something that you can't do much about. That's why we need to increase productivity. So if we were to increase marketable surplus, again, marketable surplus is important for development. Okay, so if we were to do so, then we need to find ways to increase productivity in the agriculture sector. So what do we mean by that, and how can we measure it? Okay. These are the points I would like to cover today. So as I said, I will start with agricultural productivity because this is a very important concept, and I will show you some statistics, and also I'll show you some additional readings. So I'm not gonna, you don't have to read this one. It's about different measures, how to measure agricultural productivity or productivity in agriculture sector. But I think this one will show you the picture, will show you exactly where we're coming from, why productivity is a big issue in developing countries or in poor countries. And then we'll talk in more details about these sort of barriers, and then land reform and what that means. So, as we said before, agricultural sector contribution, it supplies food, it provides labor, savings, market for industrial goods. And to do all of that, all these good things, we need to increase marketable surplus. And because land is relatively fixed in supply, then rising agricultural productivity is very important. So just to simply put this, what it means. So productivity, that means output per unit of input. Could be land, labor, or capital. Or you could think of productivity as output per unit of land area, if we're talking about the agriculture sector. And the probably most popular measure is the total factor productivity. So the total factor productivity, it's just a ratio, measure changes in how efficiently agriculture inputs can be transformed into outputs. So if you want more readings, this is optional, as I said, so you don't have to read it. It's just a paper that summarizes more issues with the literature that talk about measuring productivity in the agriculture sector. But what we are concerned with today is this concept, the total factor productivity. Okay, so this picture here show you what it means exactly. So basically, total factor productivity will increase when output rise using the same input. So you have the same input, but you produce more. Or maybe you produce the same output, but with less inputs. So it's the same concept. So if you increase output with the same inputs, then that means we could say total factor productivity has increased. So we use this measure to know how productive the agriculture sector is. Of course, total factor productivity can be applied to any production process, not just in the agriculture sector, but we're just trying to link this to what we are talking about here. So looking at these global figures about global agriculture productivity growth, what you see here in this graph, the dotted line, which is this part, is the actual total factor productivity today. Okay? And where we're going toward 2050, we need productivity to grow on this green line, while if we carry on as the same level of productivity today, this will be how much the gap is. So we're talking about food. We're talking about supply of food. Okay? But if we follow the level of productivity in developing countries or low-income countries, this how much the gap would be. Can you see this? So it's a massive gap. Why? Because productivity in the agriculture sector is very low in low-income countries, or in the agriculture sector in low-income countries. So this is a big gap. So it's not accelerating enough to sustainably meet the needs of 10 billion people in 2015 as projected. Okay? So this is a big issue, not just for developing countries. That means it's for the whole, it's for the entire world. Looking at this, so where productivity, yes?
That's based on current consumption patterns.
Yep.
So is that like a Western consumption pattern?
Or it's an average. So this is like a global figure, so it's an average. And what drops that, what create that gap mostly is developing countries, is poor countries. As you'll see now, productivity in high-income countries is really is high, is much higher than productivity.
Actually, the productivity, I mean the actual consumption level, because
Okay.
if we're talking, a Western-style consumption pattern with all the meat, all the vegetables and food,
And how much you waste.
and how much we waste by comparison. So
Yeah.
maybe this graph is a little misleading.
That's true. That's true. So any projection is made based on some assumptions, and you're absolutely right. That's a really good point. Okay, but usually what we do when we talk about global figures, we take averages, and sometimes averages are misleading. That's true. So let's say if this consumption pattern change in the future, this will improve, of course. Yeah, this will be misleading, or at least will be in much better situation. Okay, so but if the current consumption level continues to be the same, and by the way, the waste is not just in the West; it's also in developing countries, but in different ways. Okay, so in the West, it happens at the table. Okay, when you eat, so you throw much of the food. Okay, but in developing countries, because they have issues with problems with transportation, with even the whole farming process. So this is where the waste come from. So they still do have waste as well. But anyway, so these figures might not be accurate because we're talking about projection. We're talking about the future. Okay, no one has a crystal ball to see the future. But what we do usually, we try to take to study patterns today, and then try to use averages and project this in the future, see if we continue going forward to the future the same way, what is likely to happen. And this is exactly the pictures. Of course, if these things change, hopefully in a good way, we will be in a much better situation. But anyway, just to give you an idea about how productivity in the agriculture sector is a major issue, not just in developing countries, it's for the whole world, because this is food, supply of food. This is what we eat, that's what everyone needs. Okay, so if we now we break down this output growth, to where it comes from. So this graph, and by the way, I think there's a link to this study, so you can read it in full if you want to. What we see here is the total factor productivity is the green. Okay, again, this is global, and this is average from 1961 till 2015. So recently, it's mainly coming from total factor productivity growth, but in general, and on average, globally, it's actually declining. The output growth is declining. Okay, and if you look at the land expansion, which is the red one, it's very small fraction of this breakdown. So if you look at this bar, it's very small. It's like there's not much you can do about expanding the area that you're farming. Okay, but you have to make it more efficient, the process itself, which is that green part of this bar. If you compare this to high-income countries, as I said, I'll break it down. We'll discuss it for different countries. So high-income countries, if you see here, it is increasing actually. If you compare this to upper middle income countries, look at the output growth is declining. Here it's increasing. If you look at lower middle income countries, it's even further. It's like steeper, like you see, going down. And similar situation in low income countries. So, okay, so productivity, you see, that means high income countries, the agriculture sector in high income countries is much more productive. And I'll see more figures now. I'll show you more figures now to show this. Much more productive compared to agriculture sector in developing countries. And this is something might explain why poor countries are poor. Okay? So again, it's mainly from agriculture sector. This is the world map and show you the total factor productivity growth. And the dark green, this is where it is more than 3%, the growth rate. This green, that means it's between 1 and 3, and this kind of brown thing here, color, these areas, that means it's less than 1% annually. Okay? So again, if you look at Africa, you know again where the prop come from. So last time we showed the population, the number of population live in extreme poverty, and they came mainly in these areas. Okay, so they have major issues. They have serious issues with agriculture sector. This is the source. So if you wanna read more, again, it's optional. You don't have to read it, but if you wanna know more about where these figures come from and where these graphs come from, again, just click on that source. It will take you to the source. So this is total factor productivity growth in the entire world as a map. But what we know from this now that agricultural productivity is very low in most developing countries.
The global population will grow from 7 to 9 billion people in 40 years, representing the most significant challenge of our time. Adding further complexity are scarce natural resources, water shortages, changing diets, urbanization, climate change, politics, and financial markets. To sustainably feed the world by 2050 and conserve the natural resource base, we must increase agricultural productivity. At the World Food Prize Symposium, the Global Harvest Initiative released its third annual Global Agricultural Productivity Report. The GAP report serves as a benchmark of the progress made towards sustainably doubling agricultural output over the next 40 years.
There is no substitute for getting agricultural productivity up. That's actually a sine qua non. We have to do that.
I think that's what the Global Agricultural Productivity Report does every year, is that it draws in new audiences and helps them fully understand the value of increasing productivity.
The GAP report measures productivity growth in terms of total factor productivity, or TFP.
What Total Factor Productivity tries to do is look at all of the resources being used in agricultural production. It says, can we use those resources more efficiently? It allows us to get more output from that whole bundle of input.
The GAP report features the signature GAP Index, an annual measurement comparing the rate of total factor productivity growth against growth rate of 1.75 is required to meet global needs. This year's report indicates that global TFP is rising at an average annual rate of 1.84%. Even while global rate is above the necessary target, some regional rates are tracking poorly and warrant increased attention.
Of greatest concern to me is the continued stagnant productivity picture for sub-Saharan Africa.
In sub-Saharan Africa, at the current rate of productivity growth, only 13% of the region's food demand can be met. The GAP report also finds varying food demand gaps in the regions of East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and Middle East and North Africa. In contrast, at the current rate of productivity growth, the Latin America and Caribbean region will produce a substantial food surplus by 2030. The GAP report focuses on several policies to address these regional challenges and funds
GAP report and how these figures are calculated. Again, everything I showed here is based on the latest report. The video is bit outdated, so it's 2012, but just give you an idea about how important productivity is. So, as I said, this is the report for 2018, so you can read more if you want about the latest figures and projections about 2015 and how we're going to meet those. Just more figures, just quickly to show you now using a different measure, which is labor productivity. So if we look at the value added per worker, and you compare different regions of the world. So, for example, looking at low-income countries, so this is 310, that is the value added per worker, that's US dollar. If you compare this to in high-income countries, so 24,000, more than, yeah, 24,509. So compare these two. So if you think about this, this is less than $1 a day, okay? So if this is how much they produce per person every year, or the value added per worker per year, so that means less than $1 per day. You compare this, it's nearly like 1/20 of what developed, what value added per worker is in developed countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, sub-Saharan South Asia is less than here is less than $2 per day. So this is labor productivity. It's not the total factor productivity. We're looking at labor productivity, which is here is the value added per worker. This is again very similar map to what we've seen, but rather than looking at total factor productivity, we're looking at the value added per worker in the agriculture sector. Okay, so these red areas, that means it's more, and these light colors means like these are very low labor productivity. So again, it might give you an idea about why the poor are poor. So it's mainly about productivity, and we need to, so increasing productivity is something essential, something very important and crucial for any policy that try to lift those people out of poverty. Okay, so the question now, so the conclusion of this from all these figures, maps and video, so it's telling us one thing, only one thing, okay? As productivity is very low in poor countries. Okay, I'm talking about agriculture productivity. It's very low in poor countries. My question now: what factors hold back productivity growth in agriculture sector in poor countries? And I do encourage you to compare these figures and statistics and the maps we've seen today with what we showed in the previous lecture. So if you make link between these two, you'll see this is exactly where the poor live. So where agricultural productivity is very low, this is exactly where the poor live. So if you compare these figures with what we showed last lecture, you might see how they both are linked, how low agricultural productivity can explain why the poor are poor. So why they are poor? Because of course low productivity. So what we're going to talk about next, okay, is what factors hold back productivity growth in agriculture sector in poor countries. And I'm going to talk about different types of factors. First, I will start with some natural or different policies or international markets, and then I will talk about something more fundamental in rural areas, and this is exactly what I have experienced in my childhood when I was back home in Egypt. So let me start first with the most obvious reasons, but then we'll talk about even what is even more than this, more important than these factors. So if I want to start with these factors, geographic factors, it could be climate or poor quality of land, or inappropriate land labor ratio, so we don't have the right mix between labor and land. Urban bias against agriculture. We already talked about pricing agricultural products and how keeping agricultural products, the price of agricultural products low, was thought to be important for industrial development, and unfair competition between developed and developing countries in international markets. So I'm just going to start with a few of these quickly, just to give you an idea what we're talking about here. So geographic determinism, climate and terrain determine obviously what goods a country can produce. It's very important. So it depends how good the land is. The amount of cultivatable land available per inhabitant means how much land you have, you can actually farm. And of course, land fertility. So these things are obviously things that you can't control, things that you can't change. Of course, you could, like some land is just not very good or steep, so you can't really farm. Of course, with technology, with some capital, maybe you can deal with some of these issues. Okay, so some capital can compensate for these unfavorable natural forces, but of course there are limits, because if you have a mountain, how you can easily flatten a mountain, or if you have a desert, how can you water that desert? And if you see the map of Egypt, so if you see Egypt map, you'll see that I think we became now 100 million nearly. Okay, so recently it was 90, but a few years ago it was 90 million people. So they live around the river, and the rest from both sides is just desert. Okay, so we can't use this desert because there's no water. Okay, so something, well, even if you try, of course they try to build new cities, try to farm some areas, transfer water, but there are limits to how much you can do. Okay, so this is one thing, but again, this is not the whole story. Why? Because even around this area, around the river, there are poor people around the river, whereas good farms or good land to farm exist, there's still poor people. The same thing in different places across the world. So the point here is that these exogenous or external forces or determinants does not explain the whole story. Doesn't give us the full story about why productivity is low. So even in places where there's good land to farm, okay, there's still you can find poor people live there. So that means this is not the entire picture. The second point, which I'll finish with this point and then we'll have a break, is the land labor ratio. So you could have too many workers in a small piece of land, or too few, but then a large piece of land. So that's the idea. So in high population density, usually you would have high ratio of labor to land. So that means low productivity. In that case, maybe if you add small amount of capital, this might help to increase productivity. But on other area, you could have high ratio of land to labor. So you have large areas of labor, of lands, but you don't have enough workers or enough labor to work on this land. Again, this will result on low productivity, and in that case, you need much more capital to deal with this issue. So As examples, you could look at most countries in Asia. They have high ratio of labor to land, and that means if you add small units of capital, that might help. That could be like irrigation, new irrigation methods, or fertilizers, or drainage systems, etc. The opposite situation exists in Africa and Latin America, where there's scarce of labor is scarce, and that means you may need more capital. So looking at these two factors, geographic determinism and geographical factors and land labor ratio, they don't really explain the full story why productivity is low, okay? Because we still, to some extent, we can handle these issues. After the break, so we'll have a 10-minute break, then we'll come back to finish those factors which we just started, and then we'll move to discuss even more important factors which are related to rural societies and how they live, how the norms, the values they have. These are even more important than what we're talking about. I'm not trying to undermine or say these are not important. I'm saying these are important factors, but what we're going to talk about next, the next half of the lecture, is even much more important. And I would like you to ask as many questions as you want about that part, because this is rural societies. This is how the poor live. This is their culture. This is their norm. This is their daily life, what we're going to talk about. Okay? And that's what is even more important than what we're talking about here now. Okay? So anyway, so let's have 10-minute break. Okay? But before you go for a break, do you have any question? Any questions? Okay, that's fine. So let's take 10 minutes break, and then we'll come back to finish the second part of the lecture. What we try to do in the first half of this lecture, we try to measure or talk about how we measure agricultural productivity. We show some statistics, some comparisons across different countries, and that show us how agriculture productivity is very low in poor countries, and that might explain why they are poor. And then we try to see why. Okay, so that's the part of the lecture where we talk about why it is low. So if you believe the statistics, the figures, the maps, the video that we show in the first half of the lecture, so it will give you only one message. Productivity, agricultural productivity is very low in poor countries. Then the question comes, why? Okay, we start talking about some reasons, some explanation why it might be the case. So we start with 2 points. We talked about geographical reasons. Some lands are simply not good to farm, but this doesn't explain why productivity is low, because, as I said, we find poor people around rivers. So very good lands, but they're still poor people. They're still low productive, or productivity is still low. Another reason could be the land labor ratio. So it's not the right mix. Well, with some use of capital, it might help. So again, this doesn't cover the full story. It doesn't tell us the full picture. It doesn't give us the full picture. Then urban bias. This is the third element, or the third factor. We already discussed this in the previous lecture. When we talked about pricing agricultural products, we said, well, keeping agricultural products, the price of agricultural products low was a policy, general policy in developing countries, because they want to develop their industrial sector. So to do so, they thought, well, it's a good idea to keep productivity and prices low in the agriculture sector, just to serve the industrial development. So they want to push the industrial sector forward. But it doesn't work. Okay, we show why. Because there's demand and supply side. Yes, the supply side, it can provide low farm prices, mean low or cheap food and cheap inputs, but at the same time it's low purchasing power. So no market for industrial products, okay, industrial goods, okay? So it is a problem. So we already discussed this in the context of Arthur Lewis model also. There's a reason, because we want to absorb the surplus of labor that comes from agriculture to move this or transfer this to the industrial sector, etc. So again, we already discussed these 2 points. But what is more? So urban bias doesn't just, it's not only about what Arthur Lewis said or about keeping the prices low. There are other policies that actually do the same. So first, concentrating investment in industry. So we are very concerned about the industrial development, but then we forget the most basic thing was agriculture, which we need that as well. So that they have both to go hand in hand. So you can't just think about industry without thinking of agriculture. Okay, so that could be like investing in infrastructure, schools. I just want to tell you that when I was in a school, I used to walk every day. I think to go to the nearest school, I think it's about 5 kilometers. And I was a child. Okay, so we didn't have school runs like here. Okay, it's not like your parent. And again, this is part of the culture. It's not like I was neglected by my parents. This is the culture. Okay, so I know you might not really fully understand how can parents leave their children go to school on their own, but they do. Okay, in rural societies, it's safe to do so. So it's not really dangerous or anything. So you can. So you walk with your friends to school. And when I was lucky, because my father promised me if I became in the top of the school, like in the results, when the results came out, he will buy me a bike. So I was like going to school on a bike. That was not many people had bikes. Okay, so anyway, so because there's low investment in infrastructure in villages. Okay, so by the way, that school was in a different village. It wasn't in my village. So that's why I had to walk long distance. Okay, because there was no one in my village. Now there is one. So good news, children in my village now, they don't have to do the same. Okay, and I wasn't unhappy about it. I was happy. So I didn't feel like any difference, because it's the culture, it's where you are born, and that's what everyone else does. So you don't feel there's any problem. But anyway, so this is like an example of how infrastructure investment is concentrated in cities or around industry, not agriculture. So no roads, no schools, etc. Tax incentives and subsidies to industry, again, which come against agriculture. Protectionism for industry, when you when a country imposes tariffs or quotas for industry imports, so they try to increase prices for agriculture inputs. Okay, sorry, they do that because as a result of the tariffs. So because you want to protect the industrial sector, so you increase tariffs, and so you try to protect the industrial sector all against the foreign competition, but part of these imports are these fertilizers, seeds, equipment. So that means these will come with higher costs. So again, agriculture sector is not going to benefit from that. Overvalued exchange rate. Okay, so again, for similar reason. So you try to buy cheap industry input, but that makes agriculture export more expensive, and that means your farmers are not able to compete in international markets because your prices are very high, too high. Okay, so again, these are just examples of policies that are used by developing countries, but it harms or causes damage to the agriculture sector. Okay, so that's why that might explain, urban bias might explain productivity, low productivity in agriculture sector in developing countries. So we talked about land-labor ratio, the geographical factors, also urban bias in terms of policies, etc. There's one more reason, which is the unfair competition between developing and developed countries. It's very well known how developed countries protect their farmers. They protect their agriculture sectors in terms of subsidies, how much subsidies they give them. So the USA and the EU spend $150 billion a year on farm subsidies. Can you imagine? So you're going to tell me that a maize grower in Mexico will be able to compete with the US farmers, or a cotton grower in South Africa will be able to compete with US American farmers? No way. Okay, so I was looking for some statistics to show these things. Okay, so I found like a nice article about this. I haven't seen it before, but when I found it very interesting. So what this guy tried to do, again, if you want to read it, it's optional. You just read more there. Just click there. If you don't want to read it, just see the main message of that article, what they're trying to show. So he calculated something called nominal rate of assistance. So he tried to say the percentage change in gross returns to farmers that caused by government policies. So he's trying to see how much support farmers receive in from the government. Okay, so if you have positive number, that means a country's policies are pushing agriculture prices and returns up. Okay, if negative numbers implies the opposite. Why I want to show this? Because this shows like a comparison between countries, different countries. So here's what we have. If you can read this, so the top here, this is the highest positive number here, or percentage, is Norway. Compare this to Zimbabwe, it's actually negative. So you look at Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, Argentina, Zambia, Bangladesh, Ecuador, Egypt is there. So negative number means that these, again, just going back to what that means, the rate of assistance. So they don't receive assistance from their governments. Okay, so high number means like high. This is the percentage of gross returns to farmers that caused by these government policies. Okay, so if you are interested to know how they calculate this, just go to that article. Actually, he did something more. He calculated the using this. He wanted to calculate this in US dollars. So this graph shows exactly the same. Okay, different countries here again, but in dollars, how much they receive in terms of assistance, subsidies, or any sort of policies that increase their returns or their income. Farmers, we're talking about farmers in agriculture sector. Okay, so again, you look at these positive numbers, mainly developed countries. Look at these, the bottom here, mainly developing countries, poor countries. Okay, so the idea here is that developed countries, there's unfair competition here because developed countries support their farmers, while developing countries, farmers in developing countries receive no support. Okay. The consequences of this sort of unfair competition is, or this sort of support. So we have massive overproduction in the West or in developed countries. Okay, and this surplus is dumped into developing countries. Okay, that means farmers in developing countries will always be poor because they can't compete with this. Okay. And also, that means farmers cannot compete in their own markets. How about international markets? They can't even compete. These mainly is going to be multinational corporations and that operate in poor countries. So it's very difficult for them without any support from the government to do so. So this is the unfair competition. So again, in the meantime, these countries cannot increase their tariffs because they are bound by international agreements as part of the World Trade Organization. So they can't do anything about it. So they can't increase tariff. They can't do increase subsidies because even if they want to, they can't. And in the same time, developed countries always do. Okay, so they all support their farmers. So this is ongoing issue with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization. So if you want to read more, just click on that, read more. This is a proposal presented by, proposed by China and India. Okay, we talk about the importance of reducing subsidies from developed countries to reduce subsidies to the farmers. Okay, and they both countries, India and China, they presented this to the World Trade Organization. So if you want to read more about this, this is like 2018, so it's like a few months ago. Okay, so this is like a hot issue and it's continuing issue, so it's not resolved yet. Okay, so unfair competition could be one reason to explain why productivity is low. Okay, there's no support to farmers, while in the West there's support. That means there's unfair competition anyway between these two groups. So we talked about, okay, so if these some factors or these factors that can partially explain productivity in developing countries, why it is low. So we talked about geographical factors, we talked about land-labor ratio, and then we talked about urban bias. We're already familiar with this from last lecture. And finally, we talked about unfair competition. But these wouldn't explain the whole picture, the whole story. Okay? So these are not the only reasons why. I think more fundamental forces are part or internal to rural societies, the way they live, their norms, their culture, the way they, in their daily life. It's more, it is more the problem. So the land ownership, the incentive structure, why they don't respond to that. So all these are issues that embedded into the society that needs changing. Okay, if you want to increase productivity. I don't think you would believe it if I tell you, just give you an example. I had a land, I own land. I never had a contract for that land. I rented the land. Okay, so I had a farmer who worked on that land for a few years, and then I sold the land, and I don't have a contract. Could you do the same here? No way. I have a house in my village. It's my father's house. Okay, so I received like offers to buy that house, and I don't have a piece of paper for the house. Okay, so these very small rural areas, they have their own culture, their own rules and norms that even much more like powerful than law. Okay, and I'm talking about, by the way, I'm talking about a town, North Egypt. If you go south, it is worse. In south, no, it's even more dangerous. Okay, but anyway, so I'm just giving you an idea. This is just, again, we're talking about a lower middle income country. We're not talking about low income country. So if you go down, if you go south in Africa, you will have more complications. And by the way, Egypt doesn't have conflict. So we don't have like tribes or, no, it becomes more complicated as you go south and down south in Africa. But anyway, let me just explain to you this about the structure of rural societies. Okay, you have land owners, okay, peasant farmers, sharecroppers, and tenants and laborers. So sharecroppers, I think, do you know what that means? Because I used that before in the past. So there's a farmer who use the land. So you give them the land, and at the end they give you part of the like a percentage of the crops or the output. So you agree. This is something you agree on in advance. Okay. So and this would be different from one village to another. So in my village might be different from the next village. Okay. So in my village they used to take, I think, if I remember, that was a long time ago, it was a few years ago. I think it was 1/4. I think they farmed the land for 1/4. No. If I provide the inputs like the fertilizers, the seeds, etc., I get half and they get half, 50-50. Okay, and again, this is different from one village to another. Okay, so it doesn't have to be the same in the next village. But anyway, so this is the sharecroppers. So they basically work on the land just for, and then we split the output. Tenants Again, I use the same. So they just gave me money at the end. So once they sell the whatever they have, then I get what we agreed on. Again, there's no contract, okay? And I can kick them out the next day by just saying, now it's time to leave, okay? So, and laborers, farmers, they get paid for their work. So apart from landowners, which me, okay, everyone else is poor. So I wasn't poor, and I had only a bike, okay? So we have a car and the house, and I wasn't poor because I had the land. Anyway, so all of these people are extremely poor, and because they live on the margin subsistence, okay, so they tend to be risk averse, meaning that the way they used to farm, the traditional way, that's the way they live. And if you propose anything to change the way they live, that's so risky for them. They're not going to take it. They're not going to do it. They're not going to follow it because it's so much risky. Why? Because they're going to lose everything. That's how they live, and they hardly can manage to survive, to live. Okay. So if you tell them, guys, I have a new idea for you, or I have a new way to follow, no way. It's very, very resistant. They're not gonna follow you. Okay, so they take this after the way they farm. They take it from inherit this from families. Like you take it after their father, their grandfather, and they still follow their traditional ways for a long time. And there is so much resistance to anything new. Okay, anything they are not familiar with, anything they don't know, this is very difficult. Okay, so and that's why I say the society, the structure, the fabric of the society need to be shaped if you want any development. Okay, you want to change this culture, values. You need to think about this in more depth, not just okay. The other factors are important. We talked about the urban bias. We talked about unfair competition. We talked about land-labor ratio. We talked about geographical factors. These are important factors, yeah, but there are more important factors, okay, which the society, the structure of the society itself, okay? So because poor people live on the margin, they're not going to do anything about improving productivity because it's so risky for them, okay? So even if they want to do this, even if they want to change their traditional ways, they don't have the resources to do so. Okay? So it is very difficult. So they don't have, for example, they don't have access to credit. Okay? So tenant farmers, they have little or no security of tenures, as I told you. I had somebody who's farming my land, and by the way, I've never been a farmer myself, so I don't know how to do it. So I don't know how to work in a land, okay? And that was because of my father, because he wanted me to be educated. He wanted me, and most well-educated people usually leave the village, okay? Because you look for job opportunities, and that's what happened exactly when I went to university. The university in town, and then I moved to live in town, and then after that, after I finished university, then I started looking for jobs abroad. So. And I came to the UK. So anyway, so my point is that even like well-educated people, most of them usually would leave the village. But anyway, so these, as I said, tenants, they don't have any rights, so you can just kick them out the next day, okay, without any problem. The same thing with sharecropping. So there's no security in these sort of contracts. There's no contract. I told you. I had a house. Not a house. Sorry, I still have the house. I didn't sell it. I had a piece of land. I sold it. I don't have any contract. Don't tell anyone. Okay. So any program that try to target rural societies, they need to take into consideration the context. They need to take into consideration the structure, the forms, the norms, the social norms, the values, how they live. Okay, so not just, and also this need to be complemented by access to credit, to water, fertilizers, etc. Okay, I'll tell you one very short story about someone I know. He came to me. He's an economist, by the way, and he came to me, said that his uncle, that was before the presidential election, 20. I don't remember, so a few years ago, before the uprising, okay, the old regime, before 2011. He said he had a conversation with his uncle. His uncle is a farmer. He's trying to convince his uncle that he should not vote for Mubarak. Mubarak remained in power for 30 years. So I was born and Mubarak was there, and I was worried that I'm gonna die and Mubarak remain the president. So this is a different issue about institution. I think you talked about institutions before, but anyway. So his problem is that this educated person, my colleague, my friend, trying to explain to his uncle that this regime is the reason why you are poor. And that poor person is going to vote for that president. Why? They were told, if you don't vote for him, you're not gonna receive the subsidized fertilizers. These are the institutions. Okay? Well, it's like informal things. Like there's no contract saying that. There's no like piece of paper saying that, but it's true. Okay? So he wouldn't take the risk. He wants fertilizers for his land. He doesn't care about who's the president. Okay? So he doesn't look at the like long term. He looks now. I want fertilizer for my land now, today. I'm not going to take the risk and vote for somebody else. Okay? Anyway, so just like a funny story. Like that's why, as I said, these need to be sorted out, these issues. Okay? So this is like, as I said, fundamental forces. These are the things that you need to shake really well if you really want to develop these rural areas. It's the way the society live. Okay? It's the norms, it's the culture, and the traditional way of living. You need to make them secure enough to take the risk. You need to assure them to take the risk and try new ways. Okay? And believe me, it worked because they are not stupid, they are smart. But they do this because they worry about tomorrow. They worry about today, sorry, not tomorrow. Okay? So they know if they don't do this, if there's any problem today, oh, by the way, there's no benefits. Okay? There's no benefits. Yeah, I've never seen this before I came here. Okay? Before I came to the UK, somebody who doesn't work and just receive benefit from the government. No way. If you don't work, you starve, you die. Nothing. No one will feed your children. Okay? It has to be you. Okay? So there's no this sort of social security or support at all. I've never heard. I taught economics in Egypt for a few years, and I taught my students about benefits, and I never know what that is until I came here and I saw it. Okay? So that's why I'm saying it is risky for them, and you need to make them secure first. You need to give them the incentive to change and say there's someone to support you. There's like institutions to support you. There's something behind you that you can rely on if things go wrong. Okay? So this is very important. Anyway, so this is the structure. There's one more thing to do, which is about the land holding system. Okay? So just going back before I jump to the new point, land reform, just let me just summarize the main idea. So the takeaway message of what I said. Okay? The 4 factors that we discussed in the beginning are important. Urban bias, unfair competition, geographical factors, labor, land ratio. That's perfect. That's fine. Absolutely fine. But it doesn't explain the full story. It doesn't give you the full story. What gives you the full story is the structure, is the way they live. Okay? So if you want to do this, if you want to implement any development or program, then you need to put it into context. You need to understand how these people live. Okay? So that is the main message. Okay? You need to give them real incentive to change, to adopt new technologies, new methods, etc., to take the risk. Okay? So the next point, which is the land reform, which basically based on the way the land hold system is working on those rural societies. One common feature, one common characteristics that may be across different countries is the concentration, the high concentration of land. Okay, there's a debate here, and I really would like you to read more about this debate because there's no clear-cut answer here. But I'll tell you what, like some aspects of this debate. So the land is highly concentrated, and for example, average Gini ratio for the concentration of land holding in Latin America is 0.2. So if it goes from 0 to 1, so as it goes to 1, that means it is highly concentrated. In Asia is 0.4. Just to make things clear, in Latin America, 1% of landowners own roughly 70% of the land. So that might explain what that 80% means. In Brazil, 15% own 90% of the land. Okay? So that means we have large estates owned by wealthy few. I wasn't one of those. I have small land. Okay? And small farms that are too small to support a single family. And that's why I didn't care much about that land, because it's very small. Okay? Even when I sold it, it didn't even bring money here because it's just gonna worthless. Okay? So it's not gonna support me anyway, so I just left it there. Okay? So my point is that now you have few wealthy with large pieces of land and few small or too small farms. So what is the problem then? Usually the large estates, the big farms, underutilized and farmed inefficiently by peasant farmers. Because if you go back to the structure and think about it, if you're a farmer or if you're just renting, you pay so much for rent, large rent payment. You have no security. There's no contract. Okay? They have no security. Then you didn't really care about productivity. Would you care about it? No, you don't care. And I know the farmer who had my land, he didn't care about it. Just didn't care. Okay? So the same thing. So they have little incentive to innovate or increase efficiency or improve productivity. It doesn't matter small or large land. They usually do so. If it is not their land, if they don't have security, so they don't really care much about the land. The opposite in Asia, you have too small farms because of high population density, so too many small farms. Most of these operated by sharecroppers and tenant farmers. Again, these and absentee landlords. I was absentee, I wasn't there as well. So they have no incentive again to be productive. Okay, so this is another reason. So as family multiply and debt rise, again this will be subdivided and again more inefficient structure. So too small or too large or too big is the same thing. So this is the debate I told you about. The relationship between farm size and productivity. Okay? And I'll tell you the story, but I leave it with you because I'm going to finish with this part. Okay? I'll tell you the story of the debate, and it's up to you how far you go reading about this debate. Okay? There are sources there. I know some people might not like additional sources, but again, it's up to you. So the story started with an observation in this paper in 1962 when he observed that in India, that was based on surveys in 1950, that small farms have higher yield compared to larger farms. And then they came up with this observation. There's inverse firm size productivity relationship. So as you have bigger farm size productivity relationship. So if you have larger farms, so have low productivity. You have smaller farm, you have higher productivity. But this relationship was more investigated empirically by this paper in 1971, used farm level data, and they estimate the elasticity of total output with respect to operational area of a farm, and they found that this is smaller than 1. So you'll see in the estimation betas, what they estimated is less than 1. So what that means, if the firm size increases by 1%, output increases by less than 1%. Okay, that means it's less productive. So as it goes bigger, it becomes less productive. More about this. So again, so this is observation and some sort of empirical evidence. This is another paper, 1998, and there's another report, 2000. Both show something very similar. So you have here the output And you have here the Gini coefficient, landholding Gini coefficient, and there's some sort of inverse relationship. Okay, so what is the story here? Okay, so what this story is trying to tell us, because you have these large farms, productivity is low. Okay, so what to do? Then you need to reform. By the way, this is not the end of the story. So that's the story I want you to dig deeper in. So, and also you can rely on this. This source is just, it's a blog, a post, and he's citing really a few papers that you can look at. Okay, so not just the article, there are some resources there as well. But if you want to, so the story doesn't end here. This sort of inverse relationship, it doesn't stop here. So there's like debate around whether this is true or not. But let me just tell you what is the response, how to address this. Okay, if that's true, so let's assume for a moment that's true, that productivity, if farms, larger farms will have lower productivity, will be less productive. So they say then you need to do land reform. So what does that mean? We experienced this in 1950 something, I don't remember. Okay, in Egypt, I'm saying, not myself. So the land reform is more about the redistribution. So you have these massive big farms, just make it smaller. And again, this is like, as I said, it's a hot debate, and there's something going on about this in South Africa if you want to find out more about it. Okay, there's similar reforms going on in South Africa, and to make you more interested about it, yeah, I'll give you one reason. Do you know what it is? Sorry? It's more important reason. No, Trump tweeted about it. It's another bad joke. No. So if Trump tweeted about something, that means it's very important. So you have to go and find out more about it. Sorry. I know this is something you didn't imagine this. But anyway, just go and if you want to find out more about what's happening in South Africa and land reform in South Africa. But anyway, this is not the issue here. So the point here is that land reform has two aspects. As I said, redistribute the land in favor of landless or near landless households, and tenancy reform in favor of those sharecroppers and other forms of tenant farms. So that's what it is about.
It's interesting because there are two big examples of like land reform which have failed, but Zimbabwe and Russia. So how is this balanced?
That's a very good point. That's really true, and I want to tell you something. There are people who write today about the problems in the agriculture sector in Egypt today is because of a failed land reform 1950s. So it's like similar to what you just said now. So in Zimbabwe, Russia, and in Egypt, if you want to add another country to your list. Okay, so, and that's why I'm saying here, the story doesn't end here. Okay, that's why I encourage people to dig deeper about this story. Yes, you're right, and you will see that this curve is not very accurate because there's some sort of U-shaped curve that explain the relationship between farm size and productivity, and that's what I wanted you to find out about. So find out more about this. That's a very good question. Okay, so this question is for everyone then. Okay, so how can we think of land reform as something good or good policy while it failed in many countries? He just mentioned Russia and Zimbabwe, and well, some people might argue about Egypt, but you can look at Egypt as well and add it to your list. So if land reform is something desirable, if redistributing land would help, why didn't it work in some countries? Okay? So like Zimbabwe and Russia. But anyway, so let's just carry on with this. I'm just going to finish off with this part. And as I said, so this is what it means, land reform, or this is what people usually mean when they discuss land reform, is redistribution of land and reforming the tenancy system as well. So this has to be combined with land rights, security, and this might help to increase productivity. So to encourage those tenant farmers to be more productive and more secured, so they give them the incentive to be more productive. Okay, so land reform is not sufficient. You need to complement this with other policies. So that might partially answer your question. That's why I'll tell you a hint about what happened. Land reform in Egypt was a way to gain political support because it was a new regime, okay? Because before that we had a king, it was a kingdom, and that was echoed by the army, okay? So, of course, they need political support, okay? It didn't happen right after, of course, but that's sort of supporting a new regime, and obviously that was one of the good or bad things that history only will tell. Like, you know, just people have different views on that, but that could be one reason. And what's happening in South Africa has some background, political background. Just look and find out, go and find out more about it. Okay, and I guess in Zimbabwe, Russia, always like there's some sort of politics around these things. Okay, because the idea is that you're taking land from people, compensating or not? Not. Most of the cases, no, they don't. Okay, so the government uses its power, its authority to take land from usually very wealthy people, very powerful people, and that doesn't come without a cost. Okay, so that's why I encourage you to read more about this issue about land reform and whether against or what are the issues. But in general, the main concept is to redistribute lands, and it's based on the idea that large farms are less productive, and because tenants don't have incentives to adopt new technologies or new methods because they are not secured. Now, when you give them the land, they own the land, you give them the incentive to do so, to change. Okay, so you try to give them incentive to change. Whether this is right or wrong, whether this works or doesn't work, this is something it's going to be different from one country to another, and also something that you should find out about. Okay, so anyway, so this should be, of course, complemented by other policies, as access to credit, water, fertilizers, new seeds, etc. You need to have some sort of exchange rate policies, like other policies. So it's not, it doesn't come in its own. It has to come with like a package with other policies as well. Okay, so I think this is everything I wanted to talk about. So let me just summarize quickly. We first started with productivity, how we measure productivity, total factor productivity. We show some statistics across the world, different countries, and how. And the main message was productivity is very low in poor countries. Just that's it. Okay, and then we asked why. We talked about some barriers, and then. Okay, so we discussed some barriers. We discussed how land-labor ratio, urban bias, geographical factors, and unfair competition. But we said these are factors, are important factors, but they are not the full story. So they don't give you everything. It's more about the society. It's more about how rural societies are organized and how agriculture is organized, how they live in these societies. You need to shake this first. You need to reform. One way to do this was land reform. And again, it is based on this sort of idea that there's inverse relationship between farm size and productivity, which is not confirmed. Okay, so I want you to read more about this debate. Okay, and there are some sources here you can use, or you can use your own source. And I like the example you give. So land reform failed in some countries. So what went wrong with it? It's again something interesting. Okay. So please read more about this. So anyway, so if land reform is good, it's not going to work on its own. So even if we agree with the idea of land reform or redistributing land to give incentives to farmers to adopt new technologies, it's not enough. It's not sufficient. It has to be complemented with other stuff like, as I said, access to credit, water, fertilizers, new seeds, new technology, etc. So you need to have, it has to come as a package with other policies as well. So that's everything we wanted to cover today. Any questions? Okay, so hopefully we'll start tutorials next week. Okay, please check your timetable. Okay, all tutorials on Thursday, so please check your timetable, and hopefully you'll be okay with this. So these are the questions. Those who ask me about the article, It is now on Learning Central, and also there's a link to the article on the PDF, the tutorial sheet. So please read this article, and you will see the way I run the tutorials is very, very informal. So you feel like you're sitting with your friends just chatting, okay? And you'll be talking more than myself, okay? So that's why I want you to read. Next lecture will be about capital accumulation. Remember, we're talking about factors of production and how they contribute to development. We started with agriculture, and now we're gonna move to talk about capital, and then the next lecture, the lecture after that, we're gonna talk about human capital, and that would be the end of block G. Any questions before you go? Any questions? Okay, before you go, don't go before you do the survey, please. So answer this question. Please read this lecture. Hopefully I addressed some of your question from last time. And as I said, some questions I can't really deal with, which is the PowerPoint. If there is any other way that you think I can do or I can help with this, because I don't have PowerPoint, and that's the reason. LaTeX, the platform I use, just produce a PDF. Okay. So if there's any other way that I can do that to help you with why you would want PowerPoint, I'm happy to do it. Any other question or any other comment that you think I didn't address today, just let me know about it, okay? And I'm happy to think more about how to address these questions. Or if I think I did, but you think it's not enough, just tell me what I can do, and hopefully I'll try to do it next time, okay? Any questions? Please don't go without doing the survey, okay? Please answer those questions, and feel free to go after that. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.